The year is 1962. The world is on edge. The Cold War has gripped the globe, dividing East and West in a nuclear standoff. The United States and the Soviet Union, two superpowers armed with thousands of nuclear weapons, eye each other suspiciously. The threat of nuclear annihilation hangs heavy in the air. Ordinary people go about their daily lives, but the spectre of war lurks in the shadows. In homes across America, families build bomb shelters in their backyards. School children practice duck and cover drills. The world watches and waits, holding its breath. Will diplomacy prevail, or will the world plunge into the abyss of nuclear war? At the heart of this global tension lies a small island nation just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba. Fidel Castro, a charismatic revolutionary leader, has overthrown the previous government and aligned himself with the Soviet Union. This alliance brings the Cold War to America's doorstep. In the fall of 1962, American spy planes flying over Cuba capture something ominous in their photographs. The images reveal Soviet nuclear missiles being assembled on Cuban soil, capable of reaching major American cities in minutes. This discovery sends shockwaves through the White House. The presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba is a direct threat to US national security. President John F. Kennedy cannot ignore this provocation. The world watches, holding its breath, as the United States and the Soviet Union stand on the brink of nuclear war. What follows will become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 of the most dangerous days in human history. For 13 days in October 1962, the world teetered on the precipice of nuclear annihilation. The fate of humanity hung in the balance as two powerful leaders, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, faced each other down. This is a story of how close we came to the abyss, and how, through a combination of courage, diplomacy, and a bit of luck, we managed to step back from the brink. The world in 1962 was a world split in two. On one side stood the United States, a beacon of democracy and capitalism. On the other, the Soviet Union, a communist giant ruled by the iron fist of the Kremlin. Between them, a chasm of ideology, mistrust, and fear. The Cold War was at its frostiest, a nuclear standoff where both sides held the power to obliterate the other. Every move, every word was a calculated step in a deadly game of chess. In the years following World War II, both superpowers had poured resources into building their nuclear arsenals. The fear of falling behind fueled an arms race of terrifying proportions. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, capable of delivering nuclear payloads across vast distances, became the ultimate weapon. The threat of mutually assured destruction hung over the world like a dark cloud. The United States, under President John F. Kennedy, believed in containing the spread of communism. They saw it as a domino effect. If one nation fell, others would follow. The Soviet Union, led by Nikita Khrushchev, sought to expand its sphere of influence and challenge American dominance on the world stage. Both sides were locked in a battle for hearts and minds, waging proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere. In the midst of this global struggle, a small island nation became a flashpoint: Cuba. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Cuba had undergone a communist revolution led by Fidel Castro. Castro, a charismatic and defiant leader, overthrew the corrupt Batista regime in 1959. The United States, wary of communist influence so close to its shores, had initially supported Castro but quickly grew disillusioned with his policies. Castro turned to the Soviet Union for support. Khrushchev saw an opportunity to gain a strategic advantage in the Cold War. A Soviet ally in the Caribbean, within striking distance of the United States, would shift the balance of power. The Soviets began providing economic and military aid to Cuba, bolstering Castro's regime and deepening the rift with the United States. In 1961, Kennedy authorized a covert operation to overthrow Castro the Bay of Pigs invasion. The plan was a disaster. Poorly trained Cuban exiles were quickly defeated by Castro's forces. The failed invasion was a humiliation for Kennedy and strengthened Castro's resolve to defy the United States. It also pushed Cuba further into the arms of the Soviet Union, setting the stage for a confrontation that would push the world to the brink. The United States, determined to monitor Soviet activity in Cuba, relied heavily on aerial reconnaissance. U-2 spy planes flying at high altitudes regularly photographed the island, searching for signs of a military buildup. In the fall of 1962, these routine flights captured something alarming: evidence of Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. The photos, analyzed by intelligence experts, revealed the unmistakable shapes of SS-4 and SS-5 missiles, capable of carrying nuclear warheads and reaching targets across the United States. These were not defensive weapons, but offensive weapons aimed directly at the heart of America. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Kennedy administration. The presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba, a mere 90 miles from Florida, was an unprecedented threat, a game-changer in the Cold War. The photographs from the U-2 spy planes landed on President Kennedy's desk on October 16, 1962. Kennedy immediately convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as EXCOM, to assess the situation. The mood in the cabinet room was tense, the stakes were clear. The Soviet missiles in Cuba represented a direct threat to US national security. Every minute, every decision could mean the difference between peace and nuclear war. The first order of business was to understand the scope of the threat. CIA analysts briefed the president and his advisors on the missile sites, their capabilities, and the timeline for operational readiness. The missiles could be armed and ready to launch within a matter of days. The urgency was palpable. Kennedy needed to respond swiftly but wisely. Any rash action could escalate the situation uncontrollably. The EXCOM debated various courses of action. Some advisors, like Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, urged caution and a measured response. Others, such as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, advocated for immediate military action to destroy the missile sites. The room was filled with voices, each presenting their arguments, each aware that the wrong choice could lead to catastrophic consequences. Kennedy listened intently. He understood the military's desire for decisive action, but also grasped the broader implications. An attack on Cuba could provoke a full-scale war with the Soviet Union. The president needed to strike a delicate balance between demonstrating resolve and avoiding an escalation that could spiral out of control. Section 2. The military option. Among the options discussed, a full-scale invasion of Cuba was the most aggressive. The Joint Chiefs of Staff laid out a plan for airstrikes followed by a ground invasion. The goal to eliminate the missile threat entirely and remove Castro from power. The generals and admirals presented their case forcefully. They believed a show of overwhelming force was necessary to deter further Soviet aggression. However, the risks were immense. An invasion would almost certainly result in heavy casualties on both sides. There was also the risk of Soviet retaliation, not just in Cuba, but potentially in Berlin or other flashpoints around the world. Kennedy and his civilian advisors were acutely aware of these dangers. The president was reluctant to commit to a course of action that could lead to World War III. Another military option considered was a surgical airstrike on the missile sites. This approach was seen as a way to neutralize the immediate threat without the need for a full-scale invasion. However, even a limited strike carried significant risks. The Soviet Union might respond with force, leading to an uncontrollable escalation. There was also no guarantee that airstrikes alone would be sufficient to destroy all the missiles, leaving the US vulnerable to a retaliatory strike. Kennedy weighed these options carefully. He was determined to show strength, but not at the cost of triggering a nuclear war. The president's advisors continued to debate, searching for a solution that would address the crisis without leading to devastating consequences. Section 3, the diplomatic route. A naval blockade of Cuba, termed a quarantine, aimed to prevent Soviet military shipments. Proposed by Robert McNamara, it applied pressure without immediate violence. Kennedy saw merit in this approach. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy announced the quarantine. The world held its breath as the US Navy moved to intercept Soviet ships. Soviet ships turned back, avoiding a direct clash. Diplomacy and the quarantine created conditions for a negotiated settlement. Section 1. The Kremlin's Calculus. In the heart of Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev watched the unfolding events with a mixture of apprehension and determination. The American discovery of the missile sites in Cuba was not entirely unexpected, but the intensity of the reaction caught Khrushchev off guard. The world held its breath, but Khrushchev remained outwardly stoic, his mind racing through high-stakes calculations. Khrushchev, known for his boldness, believed he held the stronger hand with the deployment of missiles to Cuba. He reasoned the Americans would not risk a nuclear war over Cuba, a small island nation in the Caribbean. The missiles would bolster Cuban defenses and level the playing field in the nuclear arms race. The Soviet Union's decision to place nuclear missiles on Cuban soil was not taken lightly. It was the culmination of months of secret planning. Khrushchev gathered his closest advisors to debate this audacious plan. The discussions were tense, the arguments passionate. The Soviet leadership was acutely aware of the risks. They understood that placing missiles near the US was provocative. But the allure of nuclear parity with the US was too tempting. Haunted by World War II, they craved a credible nuclear deterrent. Khrushchev believed he understood Kennedy. He saw Kennedy as young and hesitant. The Bay of Pigs fiasco revealed a lack of resolve. The deployment to Cuba was a calculated gamble. Operation Anadir unfolded with remarkable stealth. Troops and equipment were shipped under the cover of darkness. The construction was carried out with speed and secrecy. Khrushchev had made his move. The world held its breath, awaiting the American response. Within the halls of the Kremlin, not all voices were in agreement. Cracks began to appear in the facade of Soviet consensus. Some members harbored reservations about placing missiles in Cuba. They feared American retaliation and a nuclear exchange. Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister, was one such dissenting voice. Gromyko argued that the deployment to Cuba was unnecessarily provocative. He urged Khrushchev to seek a diplomatic solution. These voices of dissent were ultimately drowned out. The fear of appearing weak weighed heavily on Khrushchev's mind. The Soviet leader seemed determined to see his gamble through. The world watched as the US Navy drew a line in the sea. The quarantine was in effect. Soviet ships steamed towards Cuba, towards a confrontation. The tension was palpable. Would Khrushchev blink? Captain Smith squinted through his binoculars. He had his orders: intercept any Soviet ships. The fate of the world rested on men like him. The first test came quickly. The Bucharest approached the quarantine line. Captain Smith ordered his signalman to flash a message. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The Soviet captain refused to submit. The world held its breath. Captain Smith held firm. He had been ordered to avoid direct confrontation. The Bucharest slowly altered course. A collective sigh of relief swept across the bridge. While the world focused on the drama unfolding at sea, a different kind of drama was playing out in the shadows. A frantic exchange of messages between Washington and Moscow. The hotline, a direct communication link between the White House and the Kremlin, established after the near miss of the Berlin crisis, buzzed with activity, carrying messages fraught with urgency and the spectre of impending doom. The messages, often cryptic, sometimes contradictory, reflected the fear and confusion that gripped both superpowers. Kennedy, determined to project strength but also desperate to avoid a nuclear exchange, walked a tightrope, alternating between threats and concessions, hoping to find a path out of the labyrinth. Khrushchev, facing mounting pressure from his own advisors, vacillated between bluster and conciliation, unsure of his next move. Robert F. Kennedy, the president's brother and closest confidant, emerged as a key player in this delicate dance. A back-channel negotiator entrusted with conveying the most sensitive messages, the unspoken anxieties, the desperate pleas for sanity. He met secretly with Anatoly Dobrinin, the Soviet ambassador to the United States, in a series of clandestine encounters, their conversations shrouded in secrecy, their every word carrying the weight of the world. The hotline crackled with proposals and counter-proposals, each message scrutinized for hidden meanings, for signs of weakness or resolve. The fate of the world, it seemed, hung on a thread, on the ability of these men, separated by language, ideology, and an ocean of mistrust, to find a common language, a shared understanding, a way to step back from the abyss. As the world watched with fascination and dread, a glimmer of hope emerged. Khrushchev signaled his willingness to withdraw missiles from Cuba. The price of peace was steep, testing the limits of diplomacy. Kennedy agreed not to invade Cuba, respecting its sovereignty. This concession was necessary to avert nuclear war. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. The crisis, which had pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war, was over. The relief was palpable. The world had stepped back from the abyss. The Cuban Missile Crisis cast a long shadow. It reminded us of the fragility of peace. The crisis highlighted the importance of clear communication. The hotline proved its worth, preventing a catastrophic misunderstanding. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point in the Cold War. Both superpowers adopted a more cautious approach. In 1963, the Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed. The crisis paved the way for a thaw in the Cold War. The lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis resonate even today. The importance of diplomacy and clear communication remains relevant. The choices made by leaders have profound consequences for the entire world. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a watershed moment in human history. For 13 harrowing days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation. Yet, from the ashes of this confrontation, a glimmer of hope emerged. It forced both superpowers to confront the terrifying consequences of their ideological struggle. The world watched in horror, holding its breath. The lessons learned from those 13 days are as relevant today as they were at the height of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a stark reminder that the choices we make have consequences that reverberate far beyond our immediate sphere.